Okay, I'm hanging out on my hammock. Oh, I'll try not to swing so much. Oh, yeah, there's my backyard. There's the ocean and the mountains. And I wanted to do a quick video about the bacteria called H. pylori and how it relates to stomach problems, gastrointestinal inflammation, Crohn's disease, IBD, all of these things that cause belly aches. So, Helicobacter pylori, or H. pylori, is a gram-negative helix-shaped bacteria that is found in about 50% of the world's population. So it's found mostly in third world countries where the sanitation is not as good as, say, Western countries, but it is quick infecting the Western world, and I'll talk about that, or the reasons why, in a minute. But let me tell you a story about Helicobacter pylori. So Helicobacter pylori bacteria was discovered by these two scientists named Barry Marshall and Robin Warren. So these scientists discovered it in 1982, and they realized that all of the patients they had who had intestinal inflammation had this bacteria present. And so they hypothesized and came up with a theory that this bacteria was contributing to ulcers, that actually it was not stress causing ulcers, which was the previous thought. So in 1982, they came out with this theory, and their colleagues pretty much laughed at them. They said the scientists said that their colleagues were patronizing and negative and rejected this theory. So out of desperation, Barry Marshall drank a broth infected with H. pylori taken from one of his patient's guts, and he infected himself. He drank the broth, and then he immediately, of course, felt fatigue, sick, all the same symptoms that his patients were feeling. So fatigue, sick, stomach cramping, vomiting at times, bad breath was another one. So he felt all these symptoms, and he took a sample of his gut, and he discovered that indeed he had an H. pylori infection. So then the scientists started to pay attention. And fast forward, it took until 2005 when they finally won the Nobel Prize for their amazing discovery that these stomach problems were actually a problem of these H. pylori bacteria. Okay, so Helicobacter just means, Helicobacter, it's named that because it's a helix shape, so it's got like a spiral shape, and then it's got 6 flagella, or like little tails. You can kind of picture them like jellyfish tails, and these 6 tails help them swim around. So what I have found in my practice is that people who have compromised stomach acids, so basically we have stomach acid in order to digest our food and to break down pathogenic microorganisms, or the bad guys that are trying to enter our stomach through the environment. So our stomach acid has to be, our pH has to be low, so which pH low, stomach acid high. Our pH has to be low enough to create enough acidity to do this, to perform this function. And so what's happening with clients that I've seen and other people is that they're eating foods that are diminishing their stomach acid. And as a result, they're not able to uptake nutrients, and these bad guys, or these bad bacteria, are entering their stomach and infecting them. So how do they get this low stomach acid? Well, there are a couple different ways that this is happening. One is that they're eating a very high plant-based diet. And so whenever you hear me talk about how I'm a fan of meat-based diets or animal protein-based diets, it's not just because I think it's awesome to eat cows or, things like that. Like I do this because I research. In fact, there are over 45,000 articles on H. pylori in the PubMed database. So I have not read all 45,000 yet. But the point is that there's a reason why I give the advice that I give. I don't just pull it out of nowhere. It's because I've read all of these articles, I've worked with clients, and I see the patterns that develop. And one of the patterns that I see consistently is that a high plant-based diet causes you to have lower stomach acid. It just makes sense in the long run because your body is adjusting to not having to break down all the protein. That's another good point. So protein stimulates hydrochloric acid, protein stimulates gastrin, it stimulates all of the stomach acid juices that you need for those jobs that I just described. So if you're eating a high plant-based diet, your body stops making that. In fact, there's one article that it flat out says soy protein does not produce gastrin as much as beef protein. It's just right there in the literature. So if you're eating a vegetarian, vegan, plant-based diet, your stomach acid is starting to become compromised. And then what happens? Well, you start to get all of these pathogenic bacteria, you start to become nutrient deficient. There are certain nutrients that you can't get from plant-based foods, such as B12. Supplements just don't do the job as well as the animal meat. So what's happening is now they have a compromised stomach acid, and so these H. pylori come in and they swim and infect the mucosa, and then, so what's happening is these H. pylori come in and they come and they live in your mucosa, which is the mucosal lining of your stomach. And they live there, but then they don't like the acid, so they produce this urease to create a less acidic environment for themselves. Urease breaks down uric acid, which comes from breaking down amino acids. And so they don't like this, and they also, because they don't like the acid, they go try to find little places in your stomach where there's not as much acid. So you have your mucosal lining and your epithelial lining. Oh, and so your mucosal lining keeps you from your stomach acid from burning yourself. The stomach acid is so acidic, it could, if you poured it on wood, it would burn the wood, for instance. So in order to protect it from itself, we have this mucosal lining and epithelial lining. But in between, there's these little dips called gastric pits. They're a little bit less acidic. So the H. pylori becomes so abundant reproducing because, one, you don't have enough stomach acid to deter them, and two, because they're producing urease to break down the uric acid. So they go down into these pits, they swim down. The way that they find these gastric pits to swim down is through these receptors, specifically I believe the TLPB receptor. It's like a little nose, there's all these receptors that they have to find where to go. So they find it, they go live there, and the problem with this is that's where your parietal cells are and your stem cells for making like gastric acid and all kinds of stuff, and for your stomach fluids. And it really disrupts your digestion even further. And not only that, but they're breaking down the mucosal wall. So when they break down the mucosa, then you start to get ulcers. So that's why, and the ulcers are because there's no mucosa protecting your stomach, you just feel the stomach acid. All right, so this is like, I'm trying to go really slow and make it simple of how this is working, because I don't think a lot of people realize how this works. Okay, so they're down also in these gastric pits. And the problem with that is that that's when it starts leading to gastric cancer. There are conflicting reports in the literature on, does H. pylori directly mean that you're going to get gastric cancer? No, because it depends on your environment. So they found, basically, long story short, they found that those people who eat processed foods that are really high in sodium are more likely to develop gastric cancer than those who don't. Okay, so back to the gastric pits. So they're living in the gastric pits and they're causing cell mutations at a rapid pace, and this makes it more likely for you to get cancer. So how do you mitigate this? Well, first of all, you want to start with incorporating more animal proteins in your diet, because you don't want to get there in the first place. So if you're vegetarian for ethical reasons, you might want to start thinking about what's more important. Is your life more important, or the animal's life? And if you have an honest answer to that question that you're not going to change your ethics, then that's, that's fine. I'll give you a couple other strategies. But just know that the reason I promote animal-based eating is because across the board, for healthy biomarkers and healthy aging, the animal protein has all of the things needed to thrive as a human, and we've known this for centuries. It's ancestral eating. Okay, moving on. So you have stomach issues. What to do? Okay, the first thing you want to do if you're having these stomach issues is to increase your glutamine. Glutamine is an amino acid that has been found to absolutely heal the inflamed tissue of the stomach lining. And this is important because scientists up until a few years ago, they thought, oh, okay, well, H. pylori, for instance, uses glutamine as fuel. So what if we took away all the glutamine? What if we took it away from these bacteria so that they can't use it as fuel? Then surely this will help eradicate them. And what they found is actually the opposite to be true. They proliferated even more. There were more and more of these bacteria. And so they recently found, in fact, the article only came out about a year ago, August 2019, that when our body makes T cells and produces, when we have a pathogenic bacteria, our body will send out these cells to make bleach baths around the bacteria to kill it and, foreign objects. And what they found is that to find the bleach areas or the inflamed tissue, that they use the TLPD receptor for that. So it's like these little noses that seek out the bleach. So they smell the bleach and they go towards the inflamed tissue. And these are, I suspect, not the only bacteria doing this. I have a whole article on bacteria escaping into the bloodstream and settling in joints, causing joint pain. It's on my website. But anyway, so they smell the bleach and they go and they seek out the bleach, which means that that's where the inflamed tissue is, and they like to live there in the inflamed tissue. So the best thing to do with glutamine is to heal that inflamed tissue. So instead of taking away the glutamine, they decided to give the patients extra glutamine. And so they increased their glutamine supplementation, and that healed the stomach lining and it helped eradicate the H. pylori. So my number one suggestion is glutamine. The second is glycine. Glycine is an antiseptic, and it is known to kill pathogenic bacteria. So glutamine, glycine, my favorite product for that is Glutamid by ATP. You've probably heard me talk about it a million times. And that's, again, sometimes I just give you the straight answer, like, you should take Glutamid. And it takes me, 20 minutes to explain why. And sometimes I just don't have that time. So I'm going through the really long explanation today on all of this for you. So glutamine, glycine heals the stomach lining, heals inflamed tissue, helps eradicate pathogenic bacteria. The other thing that comes with H. pylori is iron deficiency anemia. So if you have unexplained iron deficiency anemia, and this happens with young people, it happens with athletes, it happens with all the population. If you have that, then you might want to get checked for H. pylori, because H. pylori eats the iron that you need, and it also blocks B12 absorption. B12 is important for nerve and cell function. It's important for making DNA. We need B12. It's also important for taking homocysteine out of the blood. I'm going to talk about that for a minute, because this was, I believe, one of the things in the plant-based movie Game Changers that was completely incorrect. So what happened was they said when you eat meat, it creates homocysteine. Which is true. If you do eat meat, the amino acids and the byproduct is homocysteine, but it jacks up, and then the B12 takes it out of your blood, B12 and folate. But if you're plant-based and you have homocysteine, which you still can have with a plant-based diet, if you're plant-based and you have homocysteine and you don't have enough B12 and folate, then you're going to have lingering homocysteine, which is related and associated with heart disease. So it's almost like the opposite really is true, that the plant-based diet is worse for taking homocysteine out of the blood because you don't have B12 and folate. Vegetarians and vegans are very B12 folate deficient. Okay, so you don't have B12 for your nerve and cell function and DNA and all the other wonderful things you need B12 for, because you're not eating enough meat and you have this pathogenic bacteria that's eating up the rest of it. You have iron deficiency anemia because your pathogenic bacteria is eating the iron. So the other thing to do about this, the first thing, glutamine, glycine, then bone broth is very high in both of those things as well. So freely consume organic bone broth, and as much as possible. The next thing, aloe has been shown to be effective. So you can take aloe and squeeze it out of the aloe leaves and ingest that. Another thing is blueberries. Blueberries, raspberries, strawberries, and bilberries, they have a compound in them that actually is specific to killing H. pylori. So make blueberries your favorite fruit. I'm not really an advocate for overabundance of fruit, but if you're using fruit as low amounts of fruit as medicine, then absolutely. But make sure you're getting your animal protein in first for your glutamine and glycine, which animal proteins are the highest in glutamine and glycine. So glutamine, glycine, bone broth, blueberries, aloe, licorice extract is another one that's been shown effective. Other than that, let's see. Another really good one would be omega-3 fatty acids. So your fish oil, make sure it's high quality fish oil, because the cheaper fish oils tend to become rancid. My recommendation is the Omega Pura by ATP Labs, or any of their fish oils. The liquid ones are really awesome. So omega-3 fish oil. And as well, there's a compound called monolaurin, which is very antimicrobial and has shown that it helps eradicate H. pylori, and that comes from, lauric acid comes from coconuts. So coconut oil, coconut meat would be good. The coconut milks tend to have additives, so maybe just be careful about those. Okay, of course, the last thing that is really important for, it's not the last thing, but another thing that's really important for healing the gut for when you have H. pylori is vitamin A. So vitamin A in its best form for pathogenic bacteria is going to be in liver. So you want to maybe, I think the recommendation is 3 ounces every month, but I would say 3 ounces once a week is still going to keep you in the safe zone. So other than that, what foods should you avoid? Well, obviously you should, if you have ulcers and you start to just pound the protein, it's going to irritate your stomach lining. So the bone broth seems to be the way to go with that. Because it's not as irritating. So you want to be careful with how you're transitioning your food. That being said, I think plenty of people who have switched to a carnivore diet cycle have found that their inflammatory bowel diseases go away because they are not eating the foods that are irritating them, and they're getting high amounts of the amino acids that are healing their guts. The other aspect of that is that the H. pylori interacts with gut bacteria, your other gut bacteria, so your probiotic bacteria basically. We have this is a long story too, I'll try to make it short. So we have these gut bacteria that are beneficial, and there's some speculation that biodiversity in our gut bacteria is good, but then if you really look at the different types, some are better than others. So Bacteroides, which comes from eating protein, is associated with better health than Firmicutes, which is associated with obesity. And the bacteria called Prevotella, Prevotella copri, especially in overabundance, is associated with nearly every disease out there. And if you go on PubMed and put Prevotella with rheumatoid arthritis, you'll see that that's associated. Also, Prevotella overabundance with COVID, Prevotella overabundance with asthma and allergies, different things. Like it's associated with almost every disease that we have. And so what creates Prevotella bacteria? Well, actually, if you look that up too, you can probably guess what I'm going to say. Prevotella bacteria is created from a fiber-rich diet, or vegans and vegetarians have the highest Prevotella abundance. So you want to try to, it's okay, I think, to have some Prevotella, but you want to have Bacteroides as your main gut bacteria. Also, Akkermansia is another one, which comes from eating fat, has been shown to be neuroprotective. And kids with autism have been shown to have a greater outcome and greater quality of life if they have higher Akkermansia. There's actually a lot of literature on that, so I won't get too far into that. But how do they know these things? When they take the bacteria they actually take it out of one organism, whether it's a mouse model or human, and put it into another one, and they see it change. So they take, for instance, obese mice with firmicute-rich bacteria, which is associated with obesity. They take the firmicute-rich bacteria, and they interject Bacteroides or different beneficial bacteria into the obese mice, and they find that the change in bacteria helps them lose weight regardless of any diet change. So and then when they take the firmicutes out of the obese mice and put it in a sterile mouse, they find that that makes them fat. So your gut bacteria are doing a lot more than you think they are. So I hope that kind of explains that. The point of this is that H. pylori interacts with your gut bacteria, and it tends to, they don't know, the scientific literature says we actually don't know how this works, but we do know that it's creating a gut dysbiosis. So the H. pylori is contributing to gut dysbiosis, and it actually also contributes to impaired glucose metabolism. So another thing H. pylori does, and the helicobacter pathogens in general, is that they impair glucose metabolism, which means you're more likely to gain weight and have metabolic disorders from eating carbohydrates and things like that. Okay, so what you need to avoid is simple carbohydrates, avoid excess fruit. You want to increase the animal protein gradually and heal that gut lining, get that glutamine in. Oop. Dropped my phone. You're going to be deficient in all kinds of vitamins, so you want to try to get those vitamins in the best ways you can. And yeah, so those are a few of the ways that I help my clients with gut issues. Oh yeah, one more thing. So zinc is also antimicrobial, so you want to increase the zinc in your diet, and zinc is found mostly in shellfish and also in red meat. So you want to increase the zinc. That's been shown to have a really great effect on H. pylori and on pathogens and the immune system in general. And you want to avoid alcohol. Alcohol and smoking are really, really bad for the gut dysbiosis. Anything artificial preservatives, artificial colors are also shown to be really horrible. And also, a major component I mentioned earlier was limiting the amount of sodium from processed foods in your diet. So salt tends to make the H. pylori infection worse and worsen the outcome for developing gastric cancer. Now that means you want to avoid like your Spam and really processed foods like that, but you also keep in mind that those plant-based burgers are incredibly high in sodium. They're totally processed and have so much sodium in them that it's not good for you. And if you read the pattern again, yeah, look, if you started to have a plant-based diet, you set yourself up with low stomach acid so that your pathogenic bacteria are going to thrive, and then you're unable to digest your food and get your nutrients, iron, B12, zinc, folate, magnesium, all of it, vitamin D. You can't get that because you're not getting enough stomach acid. You've got this pathogenic bacteria that's further diminished your stomach acid. So you really need to just get on a protocol of healing the best way that you can. Okay. I hope that I gave you guys some important information today. I'm happy to answer questions. There are, like I said, there are over 45,000 articles on H. pylori, and so it's impossible to touch on H. pylori in absolutely every symptom and illness. One more thing I will say is that there's a study of elderly people that says flat out that the older you get, the more likely you are to have H. pylori. And number two, that the patients that they tested who were on a vegan or vegetarian or higher plant-based diet had more H. pylori infections than did animal-based diets. Okay, so if you have any questions, let me know. Again, I don't just say eat meat for no reason. It's for reasons like this where I see people suffering. I see that they have acid reflux. I see that they can't eat anything because anything they eat is irritating their stomach ulcers and they don't know why. Antibiotics, that's the other thing. Antibiotics are trending in the literature that it's not working anymore. So the primary prescription for when you go to the doctor and get tested for H. pylori is they'll tell you that you need antibiotics and a proton pump inhibitor, which will reduce your stomach acid. Again, we just talked about that. It might relieve your pain because your stomach is in a less acidic environment, but it's actually not going to help you in the long run. And it even says, all the literature says that if you do this protocol, the chance that it's going to be reoccurring is very high. So you can eradicate it temporarily, but it throws everything so off that people tend to start to get autoimmune issues, and the H. pylori comes back, and so it doesn't work. So they're looking for alternative ways on how to treat H. pylori besides antibiotics. And the list I gave you are some of the proven ways in the literature that it's been done. I guess one more thing I should touch upon is that people were probably wondering, how do I get H. pylori in the first place? It's transmitted through feces or that kind of contamination. So it used to come through really dirty factory meats like pork that was produced in really unsanitary factory conditions. But that was years ago that affiliation was made. I'm not saying that it's not still happening, but I'm saying that what the literature says is that increasingly it's found on lettuce and leeks and other vegetables because that's getting fertilized with contaminated feces. So you want to, basically the raw vegetables are what are contributing to the Western world getting more H. pylori infections. So say you have a third world country, or you have maybe a more unsanitary country that's producing this produce, shipping it to America. We're eating it raw, lettuce, raw lettuce. It's got this bacteria on it, and we ingest it. So this is why it's becoming more prevalent, not through contaminated meat or anything like that. It's actually through the vegetables increasing more and more and more. So make sure to, get extra animal protein. That's just going to be my theme for the day. It would also be a good idea to keep your stress levels down, because even though we talked earlier that no, stress does not cause ulcers in about 70% of the cases. Of course, there are traumatic ulcers that do happen, but in general, being stressed out does not cause ulcers. It's the bacteria, but the stress can make it worse, because when you're stressed out, you increase your cortisol, which stops your stomach digestion process. And we already talked about how we need to digest that food in order for it not to ferment and come back up as acid reflux. So try to do things like meditation to not be stressed out. If you have questions, then be sure to give me, send me a message or write a comment, and I will try to my best answer your questions. Okay. Aloha.